So Miles, you're going to talk about trees, planting and staking. And how long have you been involved in this sort of business? The way you're leaning on that spade, it looks like a fairly long time.
Indeed, yeah. I've been lucky enough to be the Kiwi2 representative for North Canterbury, and that involves helping private landowners look after bits of bush on their properties, and it's a neat job and a privilege. And of course, with native bush, one always hopes that it's going to be self-sustaining, looking after itself, producing its own seed, natural regeneration. But from time to time, we have to do a bit of planting just to give nature a bit of a helping hand. But also, I've been lucky enough to be involved with and known a lot of guys involved in the forestry sector over the last 20 odd years. And the forestry sector is commercial, it's there to make money, and one of the things they have been doing for the last 100 odd years is getting lots and lots of trees established in hostile rural environments. And of course they want to do it as efficiently as possible, and they've developed what we might call plant establishment techniques to be able to make sure that they maximise the number of trees that successfully get established and grow up to a good size. And those techniques involved a number of different things. It starts right from making sure you've got the right species for your site, getting the right sort of stock from your nursery. Should you get big stock, should you get small stock? We'll discuss that a wee bit later on. Transport from the nursery to your planting site, such as here. Then the fun part, of course, is planting. Everybody loves planting, but there's a few other jobs as well that need to be done. Just prior to the planting, it's quite possible that we might have had to clear the site from pests and weeds, put up a bit of fencing to keep the sheep out, things like that. Make sure that it's really nice and perfect for those trees to get established, that we're minimising all the risks. And then after planting, well, we may have to stake the tree. We'll discuss that a wee bit later on. There's a few other things as well. Pests will keep coming in. Rabbits, stoats, ferrets, all sorts of things. They're all very mobile. They can affect both the plants and the animals that live with them. So we probably have ongoing control of those pests and weeds, especially the weed control, which is very important. There might be a little bit of supplementary irrigation even. But if we get all those things right, it's quite realistic to expect probably a 95% success rate with plant establishment. And a lot of people raise their eyebrows at that because quite often 95% is a long way better than is actually practically obtained. But it is achievable. It's achievable with forestry, and with a few adaptations we can probably make it achievable with planting natives, with exotic trees, deciduous hardwoods, all sorts of things. It's like the links in a chain. You're as good as your weakest link, and if you get all those little steps right, then you've got a good chance of getting a 95% plus success rate. If you get one or two of them wrong, watch out.
So in the next half hour, we're going to go through a few of those steps, particularly staking.
Yep.
And we're going to start off with, you've got some seedlings down here.
Yep.
So we've got the small one there.
Right. So we've been down to the nursery and we've had a look at what they've got.
And what is your opinion of that tree as one to go out in a rural grassland situation?
Well, it's a nice little Kahikatea, so that would be chosen for a nice moist, protected site, good rich soils. In terms of its vulnerability, it's fairly small. If you look at it there, it's got a fairly small root mass. This is called a PV 3/4, means it's a 3/4 pint of material in here. It's fairly spindly down the bottom there, not terribly big. And that means it's a little bit vulnerable. So it's rather susceptible to hares, rabbits, things like that. They could damage it. So it's got a degree of vulnerability that a larger plant like this Kahikatea, which is 1 year older, quite a lot stockier. So a small plant like this has a degree of vulnerability. Now, a lot of people are very tempted to go for the small plant here because it's cheaper. I can buy two of these for the price of one of those. But
yeah, I know, for myself, I would prefer this one. I have tried those small trees before. They're just too susceptible to hair damage, things like that. So let's deal with this tree here, Miles. How would you plant that?
Well, for a start, we'll just talk about that one a wee bit more. One of the things about that fella there is that whilst he's cheap up front, of course, he's going to take a little more care to look after for another maybe a couple of years. He'll need more weed control, more pest control, those sorts of things. So what looks like an economy model might in fact turn out to be a false economy model. This is absolutely fine for a good site that's got very few risks and pest threats. So something like a garden site or somewhere that you can look after that tree really well, this would do absolutely fine. But if you're going...
the average farm situation, we'd probably go for this one.
If you're out in the rough and tumble in a rural situation, you're probably better and safer to go to something just a little bit bigger like this.
Okay, and how would you plant that?
Okay, Nick, the fun part. So we've got the right species for the site. We're assuming we're in a nice rich bit of soil here. Here's the plant. You can see for a start how it's got a nice thick root base down there. Stem down at the bottom there, and that's a very good measure of the plant's reserves and resilience. It's called the root collar diameter. It's the diameter of that stem down at the very base there.
Root collar diameter. but
Yep.
it's one of the most important diagnostic features of a seedling when you buy one. Yep.
So a good stocky tree with a good thick trunk on it. So we take that. Oh, for a start, we better dig the hole, and we've done a little bit of preparation here just to hurry things up. So the hole wants to be dug, and it needs to be ideally twice the size, twice the depth of the plant that we're putting in. Loosened. We're backfill so that it gets planted at about the same height, but we want to loosen the soil around it because, especially here, the ground's a wee bit compacted, and the roots will have difficulty getting out there. So if we can loosen the ground all around, all the better. So we've dug a hole there, just a little bit deeper than this fella here. We then take the plant out of its bag. Now, the temptation is to say, here's the life support system of this tree, let's just put it in. But there's a little bit of a problem here. This plant's been growing inside a bag, and when those roots got to the edge of the potting mix and met the bag, they suddenly had to turn because they had nowhere to go. So we've got roots that are a little bit folded and contorted around the bottom there. If I've got my good old pair of secateurs here, if we just go around and trim off all those little bent roots, like that, we're probably not taking any more than 1 or 2% of the roots off this tree. But we're getting rid of any of those little folded and contorted roots. And that means that when we plant it now, that tree will have a nice straight root system. So we're planting it in the ground. The hole's about that much deeper than the height of the plant, the potting mix in there. I'd like to bury the potting mix just a wee bit, just to make sure it's got a tiny bit of cover on it, but on good moist ground, fairly near the same height it was in the nursery. So it's in the ground, the soil on the sides comes back, and then a light firm with your boots, like that, and it's all set to go. Oh, the one thing I would love to do always, Nick, is have a watering can and give that half a bucket, shall we say, of water, just to give it a good, after it's planted, just to give it a good drink.
Good. So that tree's in the ground. We've got it in a situation with trimmed roots so that it can get out and explore that new dirt. Would you stake that tree, Miles?
Well, that's always a question people ask. A lot of people like to stake things because they think it looks as though they're looking after it extra well. But staking's got a number of both benefits and disadvantages. Trees, when they're newly put into the ground like this, have a very small, compact root system because it's only as big as the potting size, the potting mix size. If this tree had been growing in a site from seed, from the word go, it would probably have roots 50 centimetres, even a metre down into the ground, all around here. And I wouldn't even be able to pull it out of the ground. But this thing here is actually still quite loose in the ground. It's just one bit of potting mix buried in the soil there. So it is a tiny bit susceptible. The point of staking is to hold the tree root system nice and still until it gets its own anchorage, until it gets its own roots out into that nice loose ground all around there. So it's a short-term thing only for that first year, from when it's got a very small compact root system through to when it gets a large and expansive root system. Because that root system's got to be there to get it moisture, to get it nutrients, but very importantly, to give it anchorage, because that's going to stand up as a tall tree. So this fella here, he's not a terribly big tree, only about 70 centimetres high, and to be honest, I think it's very likely to be loose in the ground. It's nice and flexy anyway, so I wouldn't bother staking it. Yep. The difficulty of if we put stakes on it is that sometimes trees damage themselves with stakes next to it, and it can be a bit of a liability. So if you don't need to stake, don't bother. And let's face it, why make work when you don't need to do it?
Okay. So that tree's in the ground and one wouldn't stake it. What about this larger one behind you here?
Okay, Nick, well, we'll plant that and we'll go through the same process again. So we'll just take this fella back up out of the ground. Yep. There's a plastic bag to keep it in. We always like to keep those root systems nice and moist at all times, and I'd hate to see this beautiful little carcatea cut short by getting too dry. So we'll put that away for later.
Get that big plant. Wandering around with a tree like this is a bit like me walking around with my guts hanging out. It doesn't do it much good. So we put it into a protected situation where it can't lose moisture.
Yep, into a plastic bag and then put a jersey or something over the top of it so that we're keeping the sun off it as well. Okay, Nick, here we've got a much bigger tree than the last one we had. It's a Plagianthus or ribbonwood, very fast growing. This is only a couple of years old. And this is going to grow like a little rocket, and it already has in the nursery bag. And as you can see, there's a lot more top up here compared to the same size root system down underneath there. So if we take this fella out of his root bag, we can see on the underside that the roots have come down to the bottom edge and then they've started to go round and round the base of the bag there. Now, if we were to plant the tree just like that, we would end up with a root system that looked very much like this. This is a tree that hasn't been pruned, that's simply been put into the ground with those roots, tiny roots going round and round the bottom. And as it grew, the roots couldn't realign themselves, so they've just gotten a bit fatter. But when that tree got to probably 10 or 15 feet tall, needless to say, and a good northwest wind blew and over it went because it had these roots going round and round, absolutely strangling it. So that's the reason why we can't afford to leave those roots going round and round. These tiny wee roots we see here, if left in that position, will turn into big roots like this and the tree will fall over. And let's face it, most of these trees, we're planting them in the hope that they'll be with us in 50, 100 years' time. In the case of that Kahikatea, 500 years' time. Yep. So it's really important that we have a root system that's going to hold it up. So, same system again. We get our tree. Tend to use my old Secateurs here because a lot of potting mixes have grit and gravel in them and it makes it a little bit hard on the blades. But go around the outside edge of the bottom there, especially where those little roots are going round and round, and cut them all off nice and cleanly. So there we've removed all the roots that were going crisscross and round on the bottom. If there are roots going round and round on the sides, sometimes you can just get the blade of the Secateurs and go down the side about 4 times like that, just very shallowly. That will cut any roots that are going round and round, but it will still leave the roots that are going down to the bottom.
Yeah, to a lot of people watching this, to see you playing around with the roots like that, they think, oh my God, what the hell's he doing? But what you're doing is preparing that tree for a much better future by cutting off those roots which can't straighten themselves in the ground, and therefore they're going to form that knotted system which can lead to instability.
Indeed. We're planting this tree because we want it to be around in 50 or 100 years' time. Right. A lot of people think about the first 1 or 2 years of not losing the tree, but I'm quite happy to take off maybe 5 or 10% of the roots like this in the knowledge that at least I know that tree is always going to have good anchorage and stability in the ground.
And as you've cut those roots, they're quite a sharp, clean cut, little callus will form on the end of those roots, and the new roots that come from that callus will head out into the new ground.
That's right. It'll grow from all those little cut tips there, and we'll end up with a root system that's nice and straight like that. And a good straight root system is going to give that tree good anchorage. It's not going to blow over in a big nor'wester. Good.
So that tree, once it's in the ground, are we going to plant it, Miles?
Yep, indeed we will. We'll just take the soil back out of the hole here.
Every chance to go well.
So I've dug the hole at least as deep as that fella there, but I've just firmed up the base a wee bit so that it doesn't slump in later. We now plant this fella in the ground, like the Kahikatea before, about the same depth. If I'm planting on very loose, light ground, shingly, gravelly ground, I'll quite often plant these plants maybe even 5 to 10 centimetres deeper. That gets that root system down and a little bit safer from that desiccation at the root surface. But on good moist ground, I'd have it near the top.
So we're covering the top of the pot with soil. You keep going.
Just a wee bit of soil, yep. Some of the new...
And a lot of people plant them too shallow, and the soil settles around the tree, and then the mix is exposed, and that can act like a wick to get the moisture back into the air.
That's right, Nick. And just a little bit of something over the top, just to make a barrier, effectively, to stop that desiccation and that wicking process.
Okay, so that's in the ground. Now, this tree looks a little more floppy. Would we stake this one?
Okay, this is certainly a different case to that Kahikatea we saw before. Relative to the top, it's got a fairly small root system, and as you can see, it's very flippy-floppy. And I would say that if we got a good nor'wester, or maybe a southerly in the ground got very wet, it could get loose in the ground. And if that potting mix down the bottom, if that root system tends to rock and move in the ground, those new roots are going to have a lot of difficulty getting away. So we want to hold those roots still. But at the same time, where I'm aware that a tree like this, it thickens as a result of being able to move. So we want a staking system that will allow the top to move, but it's going to hold the root system still. Okay. So if we were to, some people attempted to put in a stake right beside the tree and truss it up all the way, dunk, 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 like this. The trouble with that is that it doesn't let the tree move, and when you take it off, the tree's flip-flopping, it's all over the place. It hasn't had that movement to stimulate it to thicken. So
we like having that alongside my arm. You know, if it was strapped strongly to there, I couldn't bend my arm, and my arm would get even weaker than it is. So it's allowing it to move and strengthen up.
Absolutely. Use it, don't lose it.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is let the top move but hold the root still. And the best way of doing that is to use a pair of short stakes like this. Now somewhere we've got a slogging hammer. Yep. We put in 2 short stakes. Nick, do you want to put that other one in?
Do that.
So we've got 2 short stakes, one either side of the tree, opposite one another. If the ground was a bit softer, we might bang in a wee bit further than that. We then get a bit of whatever you've got at home, but it wants to be something that's going to last for at least a year and not chafe and constrict the tree. It doesn't want to have any wire or anything like that in it. Something fairly soft and thick. This is old baler twine. We put one loop around the tree trunk there and then tie back onto this post here. And then coming in from the other side, I tend to go through that piece of string there just so that the 2 bits stay together, and do exactly the same over to this post on this side. Now by doing that, Nick, at about 1/4 to 1/3 of the height of the tree, what we've done is given it good stability down here. So you can see if the wind blows, the top still moves, but the root system is really very still. So that's the ideal staking system. We're holding the tree at about 1/4 to 1/3 of its height, allowing the top to move, but holding that root system still.
So we've got the stakes, and we've got the ties, 3rd height. Stakes are not any taller than that, no?
No, if we put stakes up here and use tall stakes, the chances are the trees are going to come around here and it's going to bash against the stakes. And how often we see stakes beside trees and all the bark coming off the side because the trees have been bashing or rubbing on them. So we want the stakes nice and low and cut off just down here so that the tree can't damage itself on the stakes.
Now those stakes are in the ground, but notice they're not treated.
No, there's really no point in having treated stakes because we're just trying to hold that tree still, keep that root system nice and still for 1 year, at most a couple of years, until those new roots have proliferated out there and gotten really good anchorage on the soil. So it's a short-term thing only. So these untreated stakes here are going to last for a year, no trouble, so there's really no point in having treated stakes. If you're going to use them again, by all means, but there's no absolute necessity. Likewise, the string you have here, some of these strings will only last about a year to 2 years out in the ultraviolet light. And in a way, that's inbuilt obsolescence, which is quite a good thing. It's a good safety thing.
Okay, so that's in the ground now, and possibly remove the stakes if you could reuse them in a year's time, but nothing else needs doing in the interim.
Nothing else needs doing in the interim. The main thing is that we have a staking system that doesn't chafe or constrict the tree, that holds the bottom like that, and we should be able to walk away from that, come back in a year, if it's still holding together, take it away. 1 year, at most 2 years should be enough for that staking.
Great. Okay. Do we need to run through that just very quickly, the various steps of that process?
Yep. So the main things are we're allowing the tree top to move, the stem here to flex. We're holding the root system still, so we're holding the tree at about 1/4 to 1/3 height. 2 stakes, one on either side of the tree. I've seen some people even put 3 or 4 stakes and do it from both directions like that. Have a tie system that does not chafe or constrict the tree. Some people, and I know myself included, years ago, I staked 1 or 2 trees, and what I did was I made a fatal mistake, and that was to tie a loop like that around the main trunk and then tie these bits onto the stakes. Now, as that tree trunk thickens, that little loop I've got there suddenly starts to cut into the bark.
Yeah.
And after a couple of years, if you don't remember to get rid of it, suddenly the tree breaks off because it's got that constriction. So we never ever tie a tight knot around the tree trunk.
I noticed early on that when you put that tree in, you said you get the watering can, and we'll give it a good dose of water right now just after it's planted.
Yep. Always like to give a tree a half a bucket of water at least straight after planting, especially if the ground's dry.
What about the principles of water use from then on?
Well, from then on, the main thing is that we want this tree to be able to look after itself. We've theoretically chosen a tree well suited to our site that's going to grow here. So in a dryland site, you choose dryland species that are well adapted to be able to get into that sort of site and sustain themselves. You don't want to put wetland trees into a dryland site, or the chances are they will get droughted. The main thing with water is that we've got a limited amount, and we all have a limited amount of time and effort and money to go into giving them supplementary watering. So the less we can do to look after that tree, the better. Now, there's going to be, with natural rains, etc., in spring when we do most of our planting, there's going to be plenty of groundwater available up there. So the most important thing is not so much adding water, but retaining what natural water we've got there. And that's why in the vast majority of situations, especially with commercial forestry, you will see a circle about this big around the tree with no living weeds. That means the grasses, the various herbs and things have all been usually sprayed off. It's the most efficient way on a broad acre scale. It's no competition, because if we allow all the grass to grow around the bottom there, that will be taking the moisture out, pumping it out of the ground and taking it, and no longer available to this fella here. So the important thing for a start is to look after what water you've got through good weed control.
That's weed control.
Yep.
And what we will see in some urban situations is people will mow around and they think a subjugated live weed is okay. Yep. But what do you say about that?
Indeed. There are various ways of controlling weeds. Herbicides are good because they kill it, and a dead weed is absolutely dead and may be a very good mulch over the top of the ground as well when it's decaying there. There are other ways, as you said, there's the likes of those little line trimmers, or weed whackers they're called, but I've seen so many trees with the bark taken off the side where the weed whacker got too close. Likewise, the lawn mower just mowing the grass off. It looks good, it looks subjugated, but ironically, mown grass is more competitive than rank grass. Mowing invigorates grass, so it's no good.
Roots out and about and competes for moisture.
Indeed, it just stimulates it to regrow and makes it more vigorous. So in actual fact, mown grass can be worse than rank grass. So it looks subjugated, but it ain't necessarily so. So the important thing is to actually kill, to get rid of those competing weeds altogether, and that usually means either chemical means or physical means, a grubber. But even grubbers and things like that can be fraught with perils. I remember when I grew up and learned a lot of my botanical skills, there was a thing that was called Sheffield blight. And I couldn't understand what on earth this problem of Sheffield blight was. And apparently every grubber has on the bottom side of it, forged in Sheffield, England, written on the bottom. And as one goes along there and tries to get that last little bit of grass next to the base of the tree, whoops-a-daisy, the whole tree gets chopped out as well.
So I know at home I certainly do weed control, and I mostly use chemicals. But if I had the time, I would use a mulch, and so you can use mulches?
Certainly mulch will help retain the moisture that's in there. It gets a bit of a barrier between the soil and the dry air, so it'll help retain the moisture that's in there. So mulches certainly help. If you can put a couple of buckets of good, well-rotted compost around that tree, all the better. Probably not feasible on the broad acre scale out in the country, but in the garden situation, definitely beneficial. So mulching certainly helps. It also makes your weeding quite a bit easier too, because quite often it'll make it the plants, any weed plants, root around the surface, and they're easier to pull out.
Sure. Right, Miles, I think we've covered most of the topics we were going to talk about. We've got good quality seedling, and we looked at that root collar diameter. And people should not be tempted to buy skinny, cheap seedlings because they won't survive. And we've put it in the ground. We've talked about staking. We've talked about weed control. We've talked about watering, if you need, and ideally you should not need to water a tree, otherwise it's the wrong tree for that site. So if we get all those steps together, we're going to have that thing around well after we're dead for our grandchildren to enjoy.
Exactly, Nick, and something I learned from yourself and your colleagues at the foresters, they don't talk about planting trees, they talk about establishing trees. The main thing is with the tree is that we put it in the ground, that knowing that there's a really high success rate coming after it, 95% plus success rate. And that involves making sure that we get all those little sequential steps right. If you get one of them wrong, it can be the undoing of the whole operation. But it's quite realistic to look for a 95% success rate even in rural sites. It's easy to achieve in nice mollycoddling gardens. It's much more difficult to achieve out in the open exposed countryside where there are pests, weeds, frosts and much more exposure. But it is achievable with commercial forestry, and there's no reason it shouldn't be achievable when we're doing restoration, whether we're doing ornamental trees, natives or whatever.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks very much, Miles. Hopefully this can be used for a few others to see and get that tree establishment, not just planting, that tree establishment right.
Yep. Thanks, Dick.